Douglas Rushkoff is a prolific writer, documentarian, and lecturer whose work focuses on human autonomy in the digital age. He is the author of 15 best-selling books on media, technology, and society, including Program or Be Programmed, Present Shock, and Coercion, Why We Listen to What They Say. He has made such award-winning PBS frontline documentaries as Generation Like, Merchants of Cool, and The Persuaders, and is the author of the graphic novels Testament and Alistair and Adolf. He also hosts his own podcast called Team Human, and his latest book is entitled Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus, How Growth Became the Enemy of Prosperity. I think Ralph Nader has met his match. Welcome to the Ralph Nader Radio Hour, Douglas Rushkoff.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Welcome indeed, Douglas Rushkoff. You are a rare combination of a consultant to business with an independent mind. So you know what the story is inside these market manipulators, and you also come at it from a consumer perspective on how to fight back here. One of the comments on one of your earlier books called Coercion, Why We Listen to What They Say, says this, quote, marketing continues to grow more aggressive, and Rushkoff tracks the increasingly coercive techniques it employs to ingrain its message in the minds of consumers, as well as the results. Toddlers can recognize the golden arches of McDonald's, young rebels get tattooed with a Nike swoosh, and news stories are increasingly taken verbatim from company press releases. That's the quote of the comment. And then they quote you as saying, corporations and consumers are in a coercive arms race. Every effort we make to regain authority over our actions is met by an even greater effort to usurp it, end quote. And the commentary by the reviewer says, as you survey the visual, oral, and scented shopping environment and interviews salesmen, public relations men, telemarketers, ad men, and consumers, Rushkoff, who admits to being one of them in his occasional capacity as paid corporate consultant, concludes that they are just us, and the only way the process of coercion can be reversed is to refuse to comply. Without us, he assures, they don't exist. That was written in 2000. 17 years later, with massive fine print contracts being clicked on without even being read, trapping consumers, and with ever more manipulative shaping of what consumers are purported to want, to seek, or to be trapped in a credit-debit economy, what's your view of whether consumers can really refuse to comply? How do you refuse to sign fine print contracts from various competitors who don't compete over the contract? How do you refuse to give someone your credit card in a hotel or rental car agency and you want to pay cash? How do you refuse the intrusions of privacy and the most personal aspects of your life that Facebook and Equifax and others have combined?
In certain ways, participation kind of negates refusal. At the time in the late 90s, what I was most concerned about was sort of what the automated styles of coercion that I saw being worked on. It's come to fruition today in the way that, say, Facebook uses the data it has about our past in order to market to us a future that we don't yet know we're going to live, but they do. They know with 80% accuracy if we're going to get divorced or get sick or change gender identity or go on a diet before we do. And then they market to us not just in order to sell us their customers' diet plan, but in order to increase the odds that we actually do what we've been predicted to do. When they start filling your news feed with, hey, you're feeling fat today, or what are you really eating, or want to try something else, what they're trying to do is to increase that percentage to get you from an 80% likelihood of going on a diet to a 90 or to 100. It's really to reduce human spontaneity. And that's the thing that I was getting concerned about, was watching these already kind of dastardly Vance Packard era hidden persuaders psychological techniques and looking at what happens when they move into the interactive space. And in many ways, it's gotten worse than I would have imagined, because I assumed that consumers would just get nauseous of this. They would get tired of it. And if they were being abused to this extent, that they would just log off. But instead, we're taking the smartest kids out of Stanford and teaching them what's called captology in the labs of BJ Fogg, how to elicit these Pavlovian responses to every bell and swipe and text and button on our smartphones, so that every swipe we make on our smartphone, it gets smarter about us as we get dumber about it. So the biggest answer to your question, I guess, would be that we can't even really think of ourselves as consumers anymore. That once you put yourself in the role of the consumer, you're kind of lost. That we have to retake our roles as producers and participants and citizens, rather than thinking of ourselves as the customers of these companies, because we're not. We're just the resources of these companies. What technologists do is program for what they call defensible outcomes. And that means to get you to be a customer, but so enmeshed that it will cost you more to get out than you would save by getting out. So if you run your software company on Amazon Cloud Services, good luck detangling from that, and going to someone else. It's done. These are a permanent, lifelong decisions. And, the thing I did in the latest book, in this Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus book, was really looked at why would developers be like this? Why do they want to have such, frankly, evil companies that really don't serve? When an Uber goes into a taxi market, they're not trying to help people get to places better. They just are looking for the low-hanging fruit of an inefficient marketplace, and they're going to extract all the value of it and use their war chest of venture capital to lobby, as you would say, to lobby laws to promote their monopolies, the same as Amazon going to books. But when you talk to the developers, they don't understand that there's another way. I mean, there's this one moment where it all became clear to me, is when I saw a friend of mine, Evan Williams, one of the founders of Twitter. He was on the cover of the Wall Street Journal with the number $4.3 billion under his photo, which was the amount of money he made when that company had its IPO. And I thought, this guy is screwed. If you've got $4.3 billion on the day of your IPO and your investors are expecting you to make 100x, 100 times returns, then you're going to have to destroy your company or destroy everybody that uses it. You're going to have to adopt these, rapacious, monopolistic strategies, and you only establish a monopoly in order to leverage that monopoly and then go take over another one. So the minute that you interact with any of these companies as a writer, I wrote the one book that you were talking about, Programmer Be Programmed. I wanted to say something really, important in this book about, taking charge of your digital life and realizing that if you are not in charge, if you are not programming your own digital life, and I don't mean necessarily with code, but in the way you use these things, then you are the stooge, then you are being programmed by it. And I did that book with a very independent publisher who did not sell on Amazon. Because if you sell on Amazon, you've got to sell at a 60% discount and you can't undercut them. There's all of these rules that make it really, really hard to make money if you're not on Amazon. Or if you are on Amazon, but impossible to distribute your book if you're not. If I go on your show or on NPR and talk about a book, everybody goes to Amazon to see it. Yet this book with an independent publisher, I ended up selling more copies of that than most of my other books, and at a much higher margin because we weren't paying 60% and we could sell it cheaper and sell it as a paperback.
Interesting.
So what I would argue is that you can go around the system. You don't have to use Uber. You could use Lyft. You don't have to use Lyft. You could use a local cab company. I mean, most of them have little apps now because they've caught up. You can operate outside that system. And I agree. Platform cooperatives are a terrific alternative to the platform monopolies that are being set up by these companies. These are worker-owned companies. Or a notion that I kind of borrowed from the Catholic popes of the early part of the 20th century, where they were arguing for something they called distributism, which means that the workers need to own the means of production, whether that in their time it was the little tools that they used to be plumbers or carpenters, or today, whether they're co-owners in the platform that they're building. Because if they're owners of the platform, then all of a sudden the priorities change. They're no longer growth-obsessed corporate monoliths, which is the real problem here. It's the growth imperative in the economy. And instead, they start to think about how can we optimize for the velocity of money? How can we optimize for transactions? How can we operate more like a family business that's looking at how do we create a sustainable business that enriches the marketplace on which it depends, rather than a short-term business that balloons by destroying the marketplace from which it's extracting value. The problem with the way that we're currently developing technology is that we're not looking at how can we make technologies that make people's lives better or more convenient, or that helps them create value as people. Technologies that we are building understand human beings purely as consumers, and not even traditional consumers that need this good or service, but consumers are just collections of data that we can mine in order to sell. That's what you are. You're no longer paying with your money. You don't have money. Consumers don't have money. The middle class is gone. All they've got left to pay with is their data. And that's a really difficult position to be in. So we develop new kinds of technologies that are really just new ways of collecting rent by learning more and more about who we are, and then using that information to reduce our spontaneity, to thwart our cognitive abilities. So the only real response, and I hate to say it, is to drop out to a large extent. It doesn't mean dropping out of technology, but it means not subscribing to all of these platforms. It means becoming aware of what are called the externalities of every technology purchase and use you make. It's to look at that smartphone and realize that the rare earth metals in that smartphone required little kids to go into caves in the Congo at gunpoint to get those minerals. So people always ask me, oh, what's the most environmentally friendly phone I can get next? It's like your best next smartphone is the smartphone you already have, and not to get another one. But it's very hard for people to kind of to wrap their heads around this. And an important point to make is that, it's not necessarily the fault of the kids who are working at Google and Facebook and everywhere else, even some of the people who are running it. They just come up with a technology idea. They go to Goldman Sachs or Morgan Stanley and they ask for money. And then all of a sudden they're on a certain kind of hamster wheel that's requiring them to grow in order to survive. So the answer is, and this is what I'm trying to do now, this is what Throwing Rocks at the Google Bus is really about, is speaking not just to the public, but to developers, saying there's another way. How about, instead of having a 1 out of a million chance of becoming a billionaire, how about a 1 out of 100 chance of becoming a millionaire? Isn't just having some millions enough? Then you could have a sustainable company. Then you could look at how can you make your market wealthy rather than poor? How can you run your company like a family business? How can you start moving towards a steady state economy with dividends and payouts rather than a growth-based economy that's always about capital and selling it?
Did you know there's a company that agrees with you, Patagonia? Yvon Chouinard, the founder and CEO of Patagonia, that produces outdoor clothing and is very successful.
I know, and they're one of the few examples I get to bring up, when I'm doing a talk for these people. But the thing that you have to realize, and I haven't said this publicly before, but, I got invited out to a dinner with these super wealthy CEOs. I mean, a couple of them were like billionaire people. And the conversation eventually turned to their bomb shelters, to their apocalypse survival scenarios. Like, one of them wanted to know, how do I maintain the allegiance of my security force after money's not worth anything? Or where should I be buying land for climate change? In Anchorage, Alaska, or down in New Zealand? First, as if I really know the answers to these questions. But the thing I keep telling them is, look, rather than trying to figure out how are you going to make enough money to insulate yourself from this horrible world, what about spending your effort making the world into a place where you don't feel the need to insulate yourself from it? Then you won't need to be earning 10,000 times your average employee. You won't need billions of dollars. It used to be really okay just to have millions or even just hundreds of thousands and you could get by, but it doesn't work if you really see the world as this thing to rise above rather than this community to join.